I think there's something to be said about breaking down the process for illustrations that I wasn't a big fan of at the end, but still talking about the things that ultimately went into it. I think that in the end, even though I wasn't too happy with the final illustration, the final product, I still did think of this illustration as kind of a breakthrough in my personal process of illustrating because this was one of the first times that I really went end to end from the sketch to color phases in a way that was specifically designed to be more efficient. Like I didn't spend too much time trying to endlessly tweak the illustration and try to make it perfect in the end. And there was this point when I was making it when I basically just said I have to complete the illustration and I can't spend too much time on this. I almost view these types of illustration projects as like taking a test after studying for an entire unit of uh, math, for example. Like, say you're trying to learn a certain subject of math, like you have to study a specific set of things during the unit, and then you have to take the test, which is timed. You can't spend forever on the test. And so, at least for me, I think that doing studies for a specific illustration instead of kind of just generally throwing spaghetti at the wall and trying whatever studies to just get better in general um, was kind of more beneficial for me in the long run of really solidifying some of the uh, things that I wanted to study. And so here I kind of just used the same document. There was some perspective and proportioning issues that I wasn't really happy with the initial sketch, and I think I really hadn't at this point studied too much in a while for perspective, especially when it comes to drawing people in perspective. And I think even with the final illustration, there were still a lot of flaws that I found in the proportioning of these characters. Um, but I think it was a good introduction to be able to apply perspective to this illustration. I think it made me want to do more illustrations in the future that were based on including perspective and they weren't just kind of a straightforward uh, view of the characters because I had done a lot of those already. So I think that was good to be able to determine that I needed to work on perspective with something like this. And as you can also see, I didn't really apply something like Loomis or like uh, any kind of method really to have these, uh, especially like the head of these characters, be in perspective because, yeah, I mean, in the way that I treated this character, so, these are original characters, so obviously ones that I want to be working with in the future and being able to draw from different perspectives, but I kind of just treated her face as a flat plane instead of what the face actually is at kind of a more basic level is, kind of a more curved plane where the features in the front and then even kind of moving down the face will distort differently based on how close they are to the top. So yeah, I think that was a good learning experience, just not treating the face like a flat plane because I think in the end the face kind of looked a little bit off for this character. I think, the middle character, you know, the others were, I thought the others turned out okay in a lot of senses compared to the middle character, um, who just kind of felt a little bit off in terms of proportions. And I think uh, being able to practice a little bit more perspective is something that I think would help in the future for illustrations like this, um, even for some of the things that I felt were uh, improvements needed for, say, all of those characters that are surrounding her, as well as kind of the robot-like character who's at the top. I think just being comfortable with doing those types of perspective drawings, I think would be a good application of the process. So I also experimented a little bit with different types of inking tools at this point, and as you can see, I sort of just went for the color. I was initially thinking of making this more of a digital painting instead of trying to ink it because I couldn't find an inking tool that I really liked. But then I think I saw a video by Lucas Peinador where he talks about his inking process, and that actually really helped a lot because it kind of just allowed me to settle on an inking tool that would allow for some more line weight, line variation, and to kind of just stick with that for future illustrations instead of kind of trying to change the tool, because I think ultimately you can get line weight with a lot of different types of tools. It's not just one type. So I think it was really valuable to go ahead and try to ink this illustration with line weight, and so not just with like a monoline type of pen, and to really go the full process with that, because I think it taught me the beginning stage of a lot of the concepts that go into inking, like being able to use lighter lines closer to light sources, for example, and kind of just add a lot of those kinds of variations based on what areas are more in shadow, what areas overlap. And there was this video by with Mark Morales that was on Proco that I saw, and it actually really helped. I think he was inking an illustration of Black Panther, and that video kind of helped solidify a lot of those things. But I think also when it comes to the coloring process, there was a lot of things that I didn't have down yet. I think that I did start out with kind of these gray flats layers, and I think that really helped because it allowed me to use clipping masks in Procreate to be able to lay down some of the blocks of shadow and things like that. But with that middle character, she had already had a lot of the colors laid out in that phase beforehand when I was trying to digitally paint it, so that it made it a little bit more difficult to deal with the different flats layers separately, because they were already on the same layer. And so whenever I would go and try to shade one area of flats, it would kind of interfere with some of the other areas, like her gloves versus her shirt, for example, or the hair. So that was something I applied differently in future illustrations, is to start out with kind of a general flat layer for the entire figure, and then make different layers for each of the colors. I think initially I hadn't seen really why that would make things so much more efficient, but I think in hindsight, after doing this illustration, really having to deal with the consequences of that, and also in the middle of the process too, finding that for the robot, doing that made it more efficient. I think it made me want to use that process for coloring in the future. And as you can also see, I think I struggled a little bit with applying the shadows on some of these characters. I think that initially I was kind of thinking of the light source in a different way and not applying the kind of strong overhead light that would kind of direct where the shadows go in the piece. And I think I personally liked the outcome of the robot, the coloring on the robot, compared to some of the other parts of the illustration, just because I liked how the kind of the shiny look turned out, how it aligned with kind of the way that I inked the character. And yeah, I think it was just fun to render kind of a matte, shiny surface in the coloring phase. And I also did try to apply some sort of concepts of lighting when it comes to imagining a sort of yellow light coming from the top and then trying to make the shadows blue slash purple. I think that that was something that I learned a while before, just in terms of how to render shadows. And I think something I'd want to practice more, of course, but I think it was good to create that effect that there's sort of that shadow on the bottom of that character. But overall, there were definitely aspects of this that I almost felt like I just had to kind of go through, not spend too much time on, which I think just in general for me is something that I really wanted to incorporate in the illustration process, is to know when to just move on from a piece and to not spend forever trying to tweak the details, because there are plenty of details that I would have wanted to tweak in the future, like even just her pose in the middle, kind of with the head down and things like that. I think that there could have been a better uh, initial sketch to make for that character, because I think I had a certain visual in mind of what I wanted this to look like, with kind of the figure, almost like a comic book cover, where the figure is kind of going towards the camera in a sense and surrounded by all these characters. But with the outcome not really matching my intention for what I wanted it to look like, I think it was a good point of reflection to try and identify the ways to improve for the future so that I can get the effect that I would hope for. And also just being able to repeat the illustration process. I think to have this be something that was repeatable and kind of the, again, end-to-end process being something to apply for future illustrations. So, for example, the other illustrations that are that I already commented on, like the Jolene illustration, the Exoforce illustration, were ones that came after this one. And so this was kind of a precursor to those, just in terms of my process. And obviously there's a lot in those that I had individual critiques on, but this one felt kind of like the start of really getting down that process, because it's something that I'd like to apply in a much more efficient way for other illustrations. I think it's a type of thing that's valuable for commissioned work. It's valuable for graphic novels or for animation, just to be very comfortable rendering certain things from start to finish. So yeah, I think that even though I had been doing art for a long time before this, there were just a lot of kind of ways that the process was very inefficient and not very repeatable. Like I would spend forever on a certain illustration just trying to get it perfect, and to some extent I think it did turn out more polished looking, but kind of the downside of that is that I really didn't feel like I wanted to repeat that process again and try and get better at the process, because I was also just using a bunch of different processes at that point, different tools or different approaches, like digital painting versus a certain illustration method. So to be able to settle on something like this felt like the bigger breakthrough than what actually ended up happening for the final piece. And yeah, I think I did follow up with this kind of small comic-like illustration, and I think this part was honestly a little more this part was more fun than the rest of the illustration in some sense, just because I was able to take some of the things that I learned with that illustration and just kind of have some more fun with it, because I think that's definitely an important part for what I see as art, is to have fun. So yeah.